Hey everyone, this is John, and it's that time of year again. The Japanese maples have leafed out and they're starting to look beautiful. There's a lot of beautiful colors in the Japanese maple seedlings right now and in the trees. And so I have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about now is the time to go ahead and dig up the Japanese maple seedlings that are in maybe the mulched areas underneath your Japanese maples, if you have that, and maybe where you can find those, as I've talked about in past videos. We'll talk about that briefly. And then I also want to talk about the variation when you grow Japanese maples by seed. There's a lot of variation in the color, in the leaf shape, and also in the growth pattern of the plant itself. So I want to talk about that. We're going to do some rooting of cuttings, and I'll show you what I did last year and how that worked. And then I'll talk about my method I'm going to use this year, how you can root Japanese maple cuttings from trees that you either have access to by maybe friends that allow you to take cuttings from their trees, whether you buy cuttings or if you have trees that you can cut yourself. We'll talk about also that process and how I do that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about really the direction of this channel, where this channel is going, and I hope to put a lot more content out in the future, and how you can follow along with that. So a lot of exciting things to talk about today, and we'll talk about some other topics as well, but those are the main topics. So follow along with me today as we do some exciting things with Japanese maples in my garden. So I'm out in a mulched area near one of my Japanese maple trees. I believe it's a bloodgood or a very similar variety. And you can notice here in this area there are a large number of seedlings from last year's seeds that fell from the tree that just naturally fell in this mulched area, and then they are growing up into little trees. You'll notice that, for instance, this one here has its true leaves, and so what I like to do is I like to wait for these first true leaves to form, as I've talked about in past videos, and then go ahead and dig those up and put these in a 4-inch pot. Here's a good example of a few Japanese maple seedlings side by side. You can see when the plant first germinates and grows up, you have these two little basic leaves that form up, and then you can see the true leaves actually forming there in the middle. And then on this one here, you can see that the true leaves have started to grow out. And so at this stage is when I want to dig these up. I feel like they actually have a good enough root system at this point to go ahead and be transplanted. So I'm gonna go ahead and dig a bunch of these up, and I'll show you what I put them in. You can see there that's got a pretty good root system. This particular one, I've got quite a bit of the root system, so that should transplant very well. Okay, the process is really simple here. I won't take a lot of time here, but you can see this particular plant has a nice amount of roots there, and so I'm just going to make sure that I poke a little hole here in this nursery tray that has 4-inch pots in it, and I'm just going to carefully tuck that in like that, and then put the dirt around it. So you notice, just tuck it in like that, and I'm going to do that for each one of these 18 little plants. Then we'll water that in. After this, I want to show you how long it takes to get a good looking tree out of these little seedlings. It may seem like it may take a while, and Japanese maple trees do grow pretty slowly. After I get this done, I'm going to show you the progression of these plants. I'll show you some, once again, that I planted earlier, a week or so ago. Then I will show you ones that are roughly a year old, and we'll go through to my oldest plants that I've grown from seed, and just going to show you that progression, how long it's going to take you to actually get a tree from a seedling. I also want to talk about the variability of seedlings. Growing these maple trees from seed, I've talked about in the past, it's a lot of fun because you don't know exactly what you're going to get. It's kind of like Christmas every time. You get some that are red, you get some that turn green later on in the season, you get some that have cool patterns, some basic variegation. It's quite cool, and it's a fun hobby. I definitely recommend it to you if you enjoy Japanese maples. Find some seedlings, either grown from seed yourself, or find a neighbor's or a friend's tree and get permission from them, or from your own tree. Dig up these little seedlings and grow them. It's a whole lot of fun. There we go. I have a tray here of all these planted up. Now I'm going to quickly water these in, and then I'll show you the progression of 1-year-old plants through like 3 to 4 years old.
So you'll notice that I watered these in, being careful not to get too much water on the tops of the plants so that we get way down. And then I kind of pushed dirt around some of them that were leaning over to make sure they're staying up straight. If you allow the plant to get wet and stay on the soil, it might shrivel and die away. So I do that. And then as far as keeping these watered, you want to water these probably at least once a day. You don't want to keep them waterlogged or anything. If you'll notice, so these trays here, as you can see, they have a webbed bottom. They're not a solid tray that'll hold water. There's not a bottom watering tray. I don't recommend that for Japanese maples. These web trays are great. They drain very quickly. These little pots have holes in them, and they just drain out the bottom. That keeps these from getting waterlogged and you know, getting too much water and then dying. So that's how I recommend you grow these if you're going to do this. This time of year you might be fine out in the direct sunlight because it's not getting that hot, at least here in our zone 8 garden. It's not getting so hot, so maybe they'll be fine. But in general, it's probably going to be good to put these under a shade cloth or an area of indirect sunlight until they have a little bit of time to establish themselves, grow some root system, and take on. And then even then, as I'll show you in a second, I grow my Japanese maples in shaded areas and under shade cloth to keep them from being sunburned. Japanese maples are understory plants traditionally, and they thrive better with indirect sunlight.
So I want to show you what these seedlings will look like after 1 year, 2 year, 3 years and on, and what you can kind of expect growth cycle wise, how long it's going to take to get a tree out of your seedling. So here's a seedling that we planted up this year, and so you can see it's pretty small. It's looking pretty good. That looks like a pretty good healthy seedling. Then you have one that was planted up last year. This is 1 year old going on its 2nd year. You can see the size there. Looks like a good healthy tree. This will get potted up probably not too long, maybe later on this season. I'll go ahead and pot this up to a gallon plant. Then you have one that is somewhere probably, I didn't keep records on this one, but this looks like this is at about a 2-year-old tree moving on to its 3rd year. And sometimes plants in this stage of growth will be quite a bit taller, more instead of more of a bush growth like this one, there'll be a taller, more gangly style. But this particular one is a good example of one that I'm watching that I like the growth pattern of that one. And then you have one that's going on somewhere around 3 years old, and you can see the size difference of this one. This one's quite a bit bigger. It's growing into quite a nice looking tree. I really like the pattern here of how it's growing out. I like that it has several branches here at the top that are branching out. I think this is going to be a beautiful tree. It's been potted up in a 2-gallon pot, and that'll stay in this for probably another year, and then I will probably pot it up from there. I pot my seedlings up quite aggressively because I want to make sure they have plenty of room to grow and develop a root system. But there's an example of the growth cycle of these plants. Now I want to show you the variation in seed grown varieties. You can get a lot of variation in color, leaf shape, and growth pattern. So let's talk about that, and I'll show you some examples. Now I want to show you some of the variation that I get with these seed grown Japanese maples. So you can see this particular one, it's got quite a low growth so far, and it's got very lacy leaves. Beautiful variety. It's turning green, but the leaves themselves are quite beautiful. The new growth is red, and the more mature leaves turn green, but the leaf pattern, beautiful. Then you have this one that is a little bit more of a feathery look. You can see the beautiful red variation colors and some greens. Once again, a lower growth. Then you have this one here, which has green to red. This will probably turn a little bit more green as the season progresses, but a little bit taller growing variety, more of that palmate shaped leaf. Some of that feathering on the edges. Then you have the more traditional, this looks more like a bloodgood, very basic, standard Japanese maple leaf, nice deep red color. This will likely stay a deep red color for most of the season, judging just by the way this looks. Then you have one like this, which has a little bit smaller leaves than that one, and almost has a pastel look to the leaf. You can see a different color red. This has a deep, like, bloodgood style red, and this one's almost pastel color. And then you have the one we showed earlier, which I really love. It's got a nice deep red with some green coming out, and it's got a cool growth. This could probably make a great bonsai tree if someone wanted to do that, or you could let this grow into a full tree. But that's just some example of some variation. I want to show you one other cool tree that I'm really keeping my eyes on, grown from seed, that it has one of the coolest looking leaf colors that I've seen. So I want to show you that one quickly as well. So this has got to be one of my favorite seedlings that I've grown so far. You can see the beautiful variation there on these leaves. The red on the edges, the traditional Japanese maple palmate leaf there, the green in the middle, it's kind of ombre. It's got that variation. This will slightly change as the season goes, but this time of year, this is a stunning tree, and I can't wait for this to grow up. And this is a tree that I will likely keep with me, grow up, and eventually take cuttings, maybe even scions for grafting from this tree. So this is one of the exciting things about growing from seed. You get cool varieties that are either new varieties. They may look similar to an existing variety, and there's a chance, obviously, you could grow something that you could name and it actually become an official variety. But even if you don't ever pursue that, you just have a cool tree that you grew, and you remember seeing this from a little baby seedling like we showed you earlier and growing it up. This is probably a 3-year-old tree, but it's really looking beautiful this year. You'll get a lot of just regular looking trees, and you'll get some gems like this one. So I'm just going to do a quick tour of some of the seedlings. You can see here on the far left, those are the plants that I just planted up today and about a week ago. Then as we progress further along, you can see some that are from last year, and there are varying rates of growth. You can see some that are taller than others. You know, each seedling grows at a little different rate, but you can see there is color variation, there is growth variation, and those are all looking pretty good. You can see in this flat, those are some of the taller ones that are getting pretty close to being ready to be planted out in gallon containers. Once again, I plant these up pretty aggressively, pretty quickly, because I like them to grow quickly. Down here you can see some that are in gallon pots and also 2-gallon pots. A lot of these are recently potted up or recently staked. A lot of beautiful red leaves. There is, of course, a green one that's unique there, you can see sticking out. But unique leaf shapes, good red color, good healthy trees. I'm excited to grow these out into more mature trees. Here are a number of Japanese maple seedlings that have been potted up into gallon containers at various ages. Some of these were potted up that are going on their 2nd year. Some are moving into 2.5, 3 years old. Just a number of different ages. Bunch of beautiful plants with some varieties like we showed you earlier. Here's a section of my yard where I have the most mature seedlings that I've grown up. These are the oldest ones. Some of these are reaching 2.5, 3 feet tall, and they're in 2-gallon pots. So now I want to take a moment and show you last year's cuttings. I took some cuttings from some trees last year and had some decent success. And I'll show you the method that worked the best, and then I'll show you some cuttings that I'm taking this year and show you my process of doing that. So I had a number of successful cuttings that rooted last year, and here are just 3 examples showing 3 different varieties that I had success with. The first one that I did a cutting from was a bloodgood tree, and you can see that that one leafed out very nicely this year. So this cutting is looking like it's going to be very successful. I also have an Alpine Weiss Japanese maple tree, and that cutting is looking good as well. Very beautiful variegation. This particular one, about this time of year, the main tree will have kind of pink around the edges. Of course, you can see the white and the green. Just a great variegation there on this tree. You can see a little bit of the pink there on this particular tree. And then I have a tree called Amber Ghost, and I took a cutting from that one as well, and that's what we have here, an Amber Ghost cutting. So very beautiful, successful cuttings. I grew these in this particular tray, this kind of tray here. It's just one of these seedling propagation trays. It's about 5 inches deep. I think it's like 16 inches by 16 inches, 16.5 or something like that roughly. And then it's got the holes at the bottom. That's important, having these holes. I want to show you what I'm going to do this year. What I had to do is I actually had to tent plastic over this and put like a stick in the middle to keep it propped. And it was just a little bit of a hassle to keep it misted and wet. You had to pull the plastic away, and I had success, but it was a little more frustrating. And so this year I devised a method that I think will be a lot better, and I'll show you that method. So this year, instead of doing the tenting method and using the traditional growing tray, I wanted to do something that would be a little easier to maintain and a little bit easier throughout the season. So I purchased a clear plastic tote bin here. This has got a clear lid and clear sides. And then on the top of this, I just drilled 3 big holes to let this vent a little bit. I can also leave the lid a little bit to the side there and let it vent that way. You know, on warmer days, I don't want this to get too warm, but you want to keep a good humidity level in this box. Then what I did is the bottom of this box, I'll do this and I'll have to fix the soil a little bit, but the bottom of this box, you may not be able to see it here, but it has a bunch of little holes that I drilled. So a number of holes to kind of mimic that other propagation tray that we talked about a little bit ago. And then inside, I just have a mix of perlite and potting soil. So potting soil already has some perlite in it, but I've just added some more perlite to that. As far as height goes, I try to mimic roughly that for probably 4.5 to 5 inch depth there, because that's what the propagation tray is, and that was successful. So roughly that. Now I want to show you a few of the varieties that I'm going to do cuttings for, and I'll show you how I cut them and how I plant them. I do use a rooting hormone, and I'll show you that process. So quickly before I take the cuttings, I want to show you what you need to do these cuttings. First of all, I just have some basic pruners here. I have a little alcohol pad that I'm going to sanitize the pruners with to make sure there's no maybe disease or fungus on them when I take the cuttings from my trees. You'll need a glass or something similar with water. You want to immediately stick the cuttings in water. And then it's a lot easier if you use some kind of rooting hormone. This is just a garden safe take root rooting hormone. Real basic. You want to make sure that you do use hand protection with a rooting hormone and some kind of respiratory protection as well. Make sure you don't breathe this powder in, but this is going to make the success of the cuttings a lot better. So let's go to a few of the varieties and I'll show you how to take cuttings from the tree. The first tree I'm going to take cuttings from is a variety called Alpine Weiss, and it has a nice beautiful variegation, a white edge with a green center, and then of course during the spring you get some of the pink variation on the foliage as well. A very beautiful variety. So I'm looking for newer softwood growth, the spring growth, and that's going to give me the best results for cuttings. And so you can see here, still a pretty good flexible branch. That could be a good option. You also want to have as many nodes as possible, because that's where it's going to root out, where these branches come off, these nodes there. So you want to have as many of those as possible. So that's a possible cutting I could make. I'm just going to look over the tree and find a best spot and then take a few cuttings, and then I'll show you how we root those. The next variety is called Orangiola, and it's a lace leaf variety, and it has a very beautiful green and red mixing between the new and the older leaves, and I'll get some cuttings from this one. The next tree is a variety called Amber Ghost. I showed you that I took some cuttings last year of this tree, and I'm going to take a few more. They seem to root very well. The next variety that I'm going to take some cuttings from is a variety called Elarian, and I'll show you once again, once I get these all cut, what to look for. But you're looking for newer growth with as many leaf nodes as possible, because that's where this is going to root. You can see the nice variegated leaf there, kind of the pink and white variegation on some of those leaves. Such a beautiful tree, especially as it develops later on in the season. Okay, as you can see here, I have the cuttings that I've made here of the 4 different trees that we just talked about, and I want to show you how I trim these up and how I get these ready for planting in our medium here, the soil and perlite mix. So we'll start first of all with the Alpine Weiss cuttings that I made. Notice that I have these in water. As soon as I did the cuttings, just shortly after, I put them in water to make sure that I can keep them nice and fresh, so we could process these. As I mentioned when we were talking about the cuttings and I had the trees out, this is newer growth. It's actually semi-softwood. It's still very pliable, and I wanted as many nodes as possible, meaning just where the branches and the leaves are coming out, because that's where this is going to root. So I'm going to go ahead and trim these up. I'm going to cut off all the lower branches and leaves. And I do want to note that when you cut this off the tree, you want to cut it at an angle, like at a 45-degree angle. And so the end of that is that way. So I'm going to go ahead and process these. As you see here, cut off all these bottom leaves. And you want to have as much as possible under the soil when you put these in the soil. And then even on the top leaves, you want to go ahead and cut off that little newest section often. And then you don't want to have as many leaves such as here. You want to limit it to just enough collecting of sunlight to feed the plant, but not so much that it struggles creating roots. You want this to create roots. So I usually take this down to just a few leaves before doing it. Something like that is probably sufficient. Something like that. And so I'm going to go ahead and process all these, and including the rest of these plants, and then I'll show you how I stick them in the soil. I'm going to stick those back in the water, and then I'm going to process the next ones here, the Elarians. These, you'll notice how long they are. This particular tree had a bunch of really long growth at the very bottom of the tree, which I would have had to prune off anyway because it was only a few inches above the soil level. But you can see just how much pink and variegation is in this. I can actually get several, probably at least 2 or 3 cuttings from some of these because they're so long. You just want to make sure that you know which end is the end that was traditionally the bottom end. You can't put the top end in the soil. You have to put the bottom end in the soil when you cut it at various levels. The easiest way to keep track of that is if you cut it at the angle, like we've been showing you, that 45-degree angle, you know that's the bottom of the cutting. So I'm going to go ahead and process these real quick as well. Okay. Got the Elarians all trimmed down. Stick those back in the water with the Alpine Weiss. Got the Amber Ghost. That will do the same thing too. These particular leaves, we had a little cold spell, and there is actually some cold damage to these leaves, as you can see. So it got really warm, and then it got cold again, and so that might affect it a little bit, but it'll be interesting to see. The tree itself is still looking good overall, so I think those will still be okay. Got all the Orangiolas done as well. Now I'm going to move to putting them actually in the soil and showing you how to do the rooting hormone. At this point, you want to make sure that you obviously have some kind of protection for your hands to not get rooting hormone on that. And then also, I'm going to put on some respiratory protection as well, a nice mask, like an N95 mask or something like that. So for the next step, I have the box that we talked about earlier, the clear tote that we poked holes in the bottom, and we put the perlite and potting soil mix in. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of figure out where I want these, starting with the Elarian ones, and I'll make sure that these are tagged for what they are. But let me see how many I have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So I have 15 Elarian cuttings. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using a rooting powder. This particular one is called Garden Safe Take Root. I'm going to be using that. I have respiratory protection and hand protection. And since these are wet, these are going to be able to take up that rooting hormone quite easily, and they will get coated as you see here. So I'm just going to carefully take one of the cuttings, make sure that as much as possible it's coated on there. Maybe dust it out a little bit, it don't need to be too thick. And then I just want to make sure I put a hole in the soil here. You can do it with your finger or a stick or something, but you want to stick that down in the soil as deep as possible and then go ahead and tuck that in. I'm gonna do a line here of the Elarians in exactly the same way. Okay, the Elarian is all done. I'm going to do the other 3 varieties in the exact same way, and I'll check back with you when those are done. So here you go. I have all those cuttings put down into the soil as I showed you with the rooting hormone. I'm going to go ahead now and water this in really well, put the lid on it, and store this outside in an indirect sunlight location. So you don't want this to get direct sunlight or else it'll get too hot in there. But you want to get maybe just a little bit of light coming into it. You don't want it in like a pitch dark environment. What I actually do is I put it underneath, say like a potting bench, or underneath the bench where I have all the 1 gallon Japanese maples. And that actually does help quite a bit to give it just enough light to where they can grow, but not so much light to where it gets too hot in there. And I had good success doing that last year, so that's what I'm gonna do this year as well. I will be providing updates through the coming weeks and months for these particular cuttings, and I'll show you the progress as we move towards them actually producing roots in sometime between maybe 2 and 3 months from now. So if you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you subscribe so you can watch that progress. Like I said, it will take somewhere around 2 or 3 months before we'll actually see any kind of root formation. And then at the end of the season, sometime late summer, we should be able to maybe tug on these a little bit, pull maybe a couple of them up, and maybe see some root growth. At that point, that's when I'm going to go ahead and pot them up into their own little container, and then they'll finish out the rest of the late summer, early fall in that new container, and then of course that'll be a container they grow into for at least another full year. I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the direction of this channel. So I'm going to continue to talk about Japanese maples. That's one of the things I really like. But I'm going to incorporate in the coming weeks and months more garden content with some other plants. So do let me know what you think about that in the comments section below. In addition to that, I'm going to be talking about like how-to things like today. I'm going to be doing more just talking to you in the garden sometimes, where we just talk about a topic that's on my mind, whether that's a spiritual topic. I am a Christian, so I'm going to bring my faith in to certain aspects throughout the coming weeks and months. And then just practical life lessons that you can learn from your garden. So just look forward to that. I hope to have conversations with you in the comments section, and also to have conversations with you as we talk about plants in general. So come on along with me. Once again, if you're not subscribed, subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you so much.